Hello, welcome to PDT's webinar on software offshore outsourcing best practices. My name is David Carlson. I am the Director of Software here at PDT. I have over 18 years of software experience. Over those 18 years, I have participated in virtually every technical and managerial role within the software development lifecycle. This could be from the upfront, software development aspects of writing the code, unit testing, integration with other components on the device, through resource management, project management, program management, as well as system testing. In my current role at PDT, I am one of the main interfaces for interacting with the customer to help find out what the true requirements of the product and what their true goals are so that we can properly staff, meet the time frames, and deliver the highest quality products we can. Today's agenda is going to focus on the driving factors on why a lot of people and companies would consider the need to offshore their software development activities, planning that should be thought about up front before you get engaged and select your company. What are all the things that you should be thinking of and taking into account, such that when you're working with a consulting firm that you understand and can articulate exactly what you will be asking them to do and what you'll be receiving in return. How the location of the company and consulting firm that you select could affect both your product, your schedule, and also your current work staff, which leads into your local resource impacts when you do bring in an offshore outsourcing consulting firm, some expectations and timeframes, and then some tools to aid the offshore project management. And then there was a little time for questions and answers. In general, there's three main reasons why most companies or individuals would be looking to partner with someone to do their development. The main thing would be budget constraints, that based on the current allocation of funds within the company and the current project needs, there just may not be enough funds to be able to hire people locally or use contractors within the U.S. Based on the current run rates. The second factor is just the overall time constraints that might be placed on getting the project done. The sales and marketing team within your company may have had commitments in order to get a customer to sign on board. That's requiring you to look for additional staff to either supplement your current staff completely or to have the completely new project done independently of what your current staff's assignments are. And that leads to the resource constraints. With additional work coming in or projects lining up, you may have other work items that are being completed, and you may not have the current expertise available within your current staff that can roll off and help staff the new project that's coming in. And so you'd be looking for support. So nothing magical about those reasons, budgets, times, and resource constraints. So when you're getting started and you're actually going and you're going to start researching firms and consulting, software consultants firms and engineering and offshore development, the planning and your research up front is going to be key. I'm going to go through a couple documents here just to highlight what should be thought about and considered when you're contacting companies and what you should be walking through prior to signing any agreements about, and help aid in your quoting process. In general, you want to make sure that from your side, you have as much details in regards to the market or product requirements that are available, that they're written down and documented. This is going to be a first step to allow the consulting firm to get a good grasp about what you're actually trying to accomplish and start driving some of these other conversations that will be highlighted. A PMP, for those of you who may not be familiar with just general program management terms, is the program management plan. And then part of that would lead into the software project management plan. I'm going to bring up a template real quick that can be found off the web of an existing project management plan. The whole idea here is that you should just take a look I'm leaving this up here so you can see where it came from. But as we go through, I want you to be highlighting some of the topics that have to be thought about in advance of creating this project management plan. So if we go through the high-level table of contents, you'd want to describe what your purpose is, the objective, deliverables and timeframes if you have them, any assumptions or dependencies that you can think of, and any other supporting information that the project's going to require to have someone from the outside be brought in and understand exactly what's going on. Then you also have your organization. As you're working with people, you want to identify, from a standpoint, which is internal staff are you going to be using, what roles of external staff or what role is the external company going to be providing you, how the managerial process is going to flow. So from estimates to staffing plans to resource acquisitions to the project commitments. How are you going to control the plan, your data control, requirements control, schedule, budget, general communications, all very high-level topics that need to have some sort of context around them when you're engaging a company so you can fully understand and break up the workload appropriately and not have any surprises down the road. When you get into the technical process, you can talk about the model that you're going to use, any methods or tools and techniques. Your configuration management plan is very critical when you're doing software development. For anyone who may not be familiar with software and the flows and the acronyms, this is basically how you do the source control on all your files, and you can actually retrieve history and versions and do diffs on 2 different files to see what the code changes were. It's very critical with the way software development is in an agile environment, and even in the old waterfall models based on how many engineers are working on there, that you must have a good configuration management plan put in place so that you are not repeating work and multiple developers are able to work in the same area and have their code come and get merged together and be tested. Your quality assurance plan is also another thing to work out in advance. Basically, as you're going through your milestones, what quality steps are you going to put in place as far as metrics that you'd be tracking? A lot of this would come back to your traceability of your system and product requirements, back into some of the design documents and test plans. And ultimately, the test plans are going to have traceability to the requirements such that when the test plan is signed off and the test is passing, that everyone's in agreement that that test did exactly what the requirements or validated the requirement as written. As we go through here, I will talk about the importance of requirements and making sure when it comes to software development that any requirements that are written are testable. They have to be written in a testable way. If the requirement is not able to have a way of testing written and discussed, then that requirement needs to be broken up into smaller requirements and or reworded such that you are able to write a test plan, have people look at that test plan and how it's actually going to act, and actually can go back to the requirement and say, yes, this validates that requirement being met. I cannot tell you how critical that is in software development because one-line requirements based on whose view and whose perception or understanding of what they think that one-line requirement is could actually lead it to be 1 hour's worth of development or it could be a 1-month effort. And so by having your requirements actually be written in a testable way, it allows your quality assurance team and your project and program management teams the ability to start writing how you're going to validate those requirements down on paper. And based on that procedure and everything that's occurring there, people can actually then understand the true intent of that requirement and can sign off on it. So I'll scroll through here very fast, but I just want to, once again, just trying to highlight some of these things, the sections in here. Here's the various roles and responsibilities that you should be thinking about within your product structure. If it's all going to be done outsource-wise, some of these roles can be handled by the same person. Some of these roles may not be required based on the scope and the complexity of your project, but this is a good list that you should be thinking about up front in your planning. We talked in general about the estimations in your staffing plans. If there's any training required, especially if you're ramping up an outsourced development firm on existing and legacy products, making sure that that's all documented. You have the design documents, the testing, the test plans, the requirements, as a handover deliverable into them, and then you're also planning that ramp-up period. Software development, based on the complexity and how the code was written, is highly dependent on having these documents done to the proper level, and also the code written in a maintainable and usable way with good coding comments. Metrics. What are you going to require from the company in regards to metrics? Whether it's a status report that's weekly, that's measuring how many work items are being completed, how many bugs are being found per week, how many bugs or work items are being resolved per week, test cases that are being executed per day, right? A lot of this stuff needs to be thought about up front, and it can be pushed off further into your project development and working with an offshore company, but you want to make sure that you're agreeing to push this stuff a little bit down the road, and that there is flexibility based on your contract, that you can revisit some of the costing in case some of your upfront assumptions seem to have changed as you get further along. So once again, this is out online. Feel free to go off and look at it after this meeting, but I just wanted to use this as a very good example of just setting and all the things that you should be thinking about from the very high level program management plan. Once you sort of have an idea from the program management point of view, I just want to jump into what PDT uses to help us do our software estimation. Because once again, I think this is going to reiterate where the program management plan is not necessarily software specific. And it's engaging a lot of things from the overall project and program point of view. For those who are not familiar with software development, I just want to highlight all the various things that software companies and teams have to think about when they're going to engage a client on a new product, such that we can properly quote, estimate, and deliver the best quality product to you, meeting the schedule. On this one tab is just a summary, and we'll go through some of each of these tabs individually. But you have to account for the project management time for someone to be involved doing the schedule, the supervision, the weekly meetings, meeting minutes, project closures, and basically all the program project management activities. From a document point of view, I cannot stress this enough. Software development and the ability for you to maintain and be able to use your software to go to other places or to have your internal staff ramp up faster is highly dependent on having good software documentation. There is no need to document things for document's sake, but fundamentally, if you want to have a good software program done, you have to have the documentation and you have to allocate the proper time to do it. And it is costly, but in the long run, it will actually save you money on less defects being introduced and released to your customers, less ramp-up time for when you're enhancing it and making new features, and just make everything else more efficient down the line. So you have your plans, your requirements documents, your architecture, interface control documents which specify how various components in the system will talk. It basically gives them the codex for being able to decipher different languages and allow two components to talk and understand how to reply back to each other. Your design documents, there's both high and low level design documents, testing, traceability matrices, your end user documentation, thinking about any of the tools, license fees, equipment, and regulatory fees that would be going on, intellectual property consideration, any other reports, how you're going to manage your risk when it comes to the software code, your coding, your unit test, your component integration test, your build environment, and then your overall software testing, the test plan creation, having a sanity and regression plan in place, and your overall defect verification. I'm going to take this time to speak real quickly too about from my perspective, I think it's very good to be thinking about your testing up front, sort of what's referred to as the test first mentality. Basically what this will allow you to do is if you think about and you get your developers engaged early on and you enforce that a lot of their coding has to be worked into an automated test framework, it may be more upfront work on the developers and it may take them longer to develop, their functions and features for you because they're actually doing it in such a way that it supports your automated testing tools and reports. But the outcome on the back end is that this automation gets built slowly over time, and as more and more work's getting done, you're able to run tests without anyone doing it. You literally can do a build, click a couple buttons, or automate it so that it can be run, and when you come in the morning, the code has been validated, and you make sure that your sanity and regression tests, that any of the new stuff that was merged into the build didn't break anything. By building in the automation, it does not require you to have an actual person that would take this build, load it up, and then have to execute hundreds or thousands of tests, which could take multiple days or weeks to get done by what you can just do up front by planning appropriately to build in automation and testing and thinking about it early on in your development cycle. So from a software project management plan, you got to be thinking about if, ITAR is the International Traffic and Arms and Regulations. We'll talk about that a little bit more. There's import restrictions based on which country you're dealing with. There is certain hardware, mainly around encryption and hardware pieces that are still not allowed to be shipped to certain countries. So be very careful when you're outsourcing your resources and your development to make sure that you're not going to get stuck with a company that is not going to actually be able to have real equipment to work on. You have your schedule, supervision, regular meetings that might be happening weekly, general project management. When we talked about documentation, right? So you have your project planning. Here's all the various documents that you might be considering in regards to the project. Your requirements, you can have manufacturing requirements or product requirements documents, system requirements documents, usability, human factors might come into play. Architecture, you can have the overall system architecture document. If your system is made up of multiple boxes, then each box would have its own architecture that would all feed into the overall system architecture document. All the interface documents, so if box A has to talk to box B, this would define all the messages back and forth and also the flows for retries if there's errors. These interface documents also could be on the same box between components and functions. They can actually be APIs, which is like application process interfaces, and not necessarily having to be true messages that are sent out. You have both a high-level design documents and you have low-level design documents. The level of information is going to be based on what the project requires. But once again, if the more detailed high-level design documents and low-level designs that are in place when you try to bring on additional staff, or if you need to go to another firm to help take on some of the work, having this stuff documented will speed up that time immensely. A lot of developers out there, a lot of people have this philosophy that certain languages are commenting, such that someone could just go in there and you should just be able to read the code and understand exactly what's going on. There's a little bit of truth to that if the person does it properly by naming their variables in a common way and doing a lot of other things that normally do not happen. So I am not a big believer in people saying that code is self-commenting. Rarely does it get done right, and it's still not to the level that I think would be very helpful. So these documents are key. Once again, you have your testing, from your system tests to possible box-level integration testing to with internally to the box, the individual component integration testing to prove out that the components are doing what they need to and talking properly, down to your developers' unit test plans for all the units that they are writing, your test reports, creating your traceability matrix that maps your test cases back to your requirements such that your quality assurance team and everyone can make sure that when all the tests are done and passing, that they truly are validating the requirements. Then once again, you got your end user documentation. And then any tools and licensing you got to think about. regulatory documents, IP, anything else, risk management. From the software code creation side, you have the time to code certain functional areas, the automated test support for doing that, the amount of time that we think you need to spend on code reviews to review the software, the unit testing activities, the component integration activities, the build environments, anything that they'd be doing to support the build environment. Overall software test, we sort of talk about the execution now. Before we documented the test plans, how long is it going to take you to execute? The metrics you're looking at. Regression and sanity suites are key. Like I said, having automated regression and sanity tests will save you so much time on the back end because they will catch bugs faster, and they do it without anyone actually running the tests. It's a great thing to have planned up front when you're dealing with multiple developers all touching similar areas of code and being able to make sure that they're not breaking each other's areas or interfaces along the development path. The worst time to find those bugs is actually when it's out in the field. There's plenty of studies that you can Google that talk about the cost of having your customer find the bug versus the cost of having the developer find it up front early in the development cycle. So that's where it's key to note that all your efforts to automate and have your developers doing this automated code environment up front may delay the early progress, but you will make it up both in time, quality, and money on the back end, if done properly. Right? So once again, this is just an example of all the things we consider when we're looking at projects that come in so that we can properly come up with the best quote as possible with our justifications and assumptions and risks around it. So hopefully this can just highlight the need up front for getting the proper project and program management plan in place, understanding the true roles and responsibility and the expectations being set. One thing that's been brought up in the past for people and companies who may be getting involved with software development for the very first time, they may look at some of these terms and acronyms and not understand what it truly means. And they want to know, well, how can I even go and talk to a company like PDT up front to get this conversation going? And the first step, in my opinion, would be leverage your current family and friends' resources. Try and do some internal networking and find out if you have or know anybody. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's your cousin's friend. Find someone who's been in the software business for, I'd say, at least 5 to 10 years. And I would say, 10 would be good. Looking for someone with technical expertise, but also who has been involved in large projects and understand the project and program management. All you'd want to do is just, bounce your idea off them. Say that you're looking to go talk with another company, then that you do not have the software experience, and see if they'd be willing to, sit down with you. See if they'd be willing to be on the call when you first call a company like PDT, and you just want to find out what needs to get done. See if they can just join the call, and as you're talking with someone like myself, they'd be able to help translate some of the verbiage or help understand and take some good notes for you to think about so that we can follow up on it later. If you are unable to have a friend or a family member that's been in the software world that can help you, understand some of these things up front and be available on the initial calls, then, I would also suggest that you would look locally to find either a consultant or another consulting firm locally, even though they may not be the offshore center to help you meet your financial needs. But what it would do is you'd have someone in your area, in your time zone, someone that you may have to pay a little bit more money for up front, but they would sort of be your technical liaison to get the project set up properly, make sure that everything's being done in a way that's going to lead to the best case success of your program. And their time, may be, a few hours up front, every week, and then maybe it would slow down as you became more comfortable with the offshore development partner. But having someone with this technical expertise that can be involved up front and through the project kickoff and sort of be your technical software local expert is going to be key. We we've offered that service for other clients, that we sort of bridge the gap initially, as a service to just, come talk to us. We can help manage, get things set up, agree and work out some of these details for you on behalf of your company with the third party that you're getting involved in the case that it may not be PDT. So please, please take that very seriously. And, if you are not familiar with software, I think it's a must-have that you actually have someone that you trust and that you can lean on in the project planning, contract negotiations, expectations, and being there to be your voice and to truly understand what the other company's coming back when they talk in certain terms and terminology. After you have all the plans in place and you're working, the next consideration would be, where is this offshore company that you're looking for? There are plenty of very highly qualified companies out there throughout the world that all offer the same sort of support and solutions. And a lot of times it will come down to cost and time zones. The one thing I want to highlight here is that there are places, and as you move around, the cost can be significantly cheaper. However, that time zone in relative to where you are in the U.S. may not be very productive either. So you may be getting a cheaper run rate, but the overlap of time and maybe the overall efficiency and productivity of the project would be slowed down because of the time gaps and the impacts of trying to get people together and talk through things. So location is a real big factor, and it's not just the time zones, which we'll get to, but like cultural considerations. In my previous work experiences, I was part of a Motorola cellular network team, and between the late 90s and let's say before 2009, we actually started migrating and bringing up remote locations throughout the world. And as those locations came up and the country became more competitive, the costs went up. And as the costs went up, that meant we had to go to the next location to try and keep costs down. And throughout my career there, I helped bring up a center in Krakow, Poland. We had one in St. Petersburg, Russia. We had one in Singapore. We had one in Hyderabad, India. And we had one in China. And all of them had their pros and cons. And when it came to some of the cultural considerations, we highly recommend that you do some upfront research and understand their culture, understand especially their work culture in regards to their management structure, in regards to what their employees feel like they're able to communicate up through their management, and understand just that working relationship. One of the big things we found early on as we were doing this is that certain cultures and certain firms, depending on where you went, were not willing to have it being very transparent between their management layer and their actual engineering levels. And you can actually start noticing, if you're very good at what you do in project management and been in the software game long enough, you can start seeing that the deliverables coming out of the team and the quality and the code is not right in certain aspects. And you start talking to the management, but the management's telling you everything's fine, we're working on things and changing it. But if you don't have access to the true engineers who are actually doing the work, and if those engineers do not feel empowered to voice their concerns on what's making them less effective, what's keeping their productivity down, and getting their ideas raised on how to improve, the work conditions, the quality of the product, etc., it's just a bad situation. So as you're working with some of these companies, one of the things you should be working out is, what's your role? Are you going to have access to their individual engineers? And I would mandate that you do have access to them to try and cut out any bureaucracy or management levels, to try and get directly to the point and try and make things as speedy and as efficient as possible. And there's nothing like getting the feedback from the people who are actually doing the work. I have one good example where we were first engaged with the company. They were not allowing us access to our workers. We didn't actually get provided their names. And we found out as productivity was slipping, they were going ahead and reassigning resources that were better matched for new jobs or better high-paying jobs that were coming in, and they kept swapping out people from underneath us. And we were never able to, we were trying to figure out why things would go in spurts and slow, or the same mistakes were being repeated. And it took us a while to break down this wall and actually get them to admit that they kept sliding resources in and out. So they were always telling us that we had 30 engineers, but their management was not telling us that at any time there was probably only 20 that had any consistency, and then there's been 10 that have been getting swapped in and out. So having that transparency, making sure it's part of your agreement and everything is key. Language barriers and everything are something that can be solved by having a translator, provided by their company. A lot of them actually have English classes and everything that they do. Our Ukraine office that is part of PDT, PDT provides English classes, and we are a firm that believes you have direct access to our engineers. They're on the calls with us, and if we do have some issues with some translations, we do have people that join specifically just to translate at no additional cost to our customers. Try and find out what you're able to control, in the relationship, and make sure you have these details and things thought about up front. I mentioned earlier about ITAR, which is the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. Be very key because, a lot of application development and everything, if you go online, you might find places in St. Petersburg or all throughout Russia. Well, depending on what hardware platform that application may be running on, or based on certain technologies, you may be restricted by the government of working with that country and those engineer firms. So please, take that into consideration. Another thing is the import and export tariffs. When we were working in India, a lot of our cellular equipment, since it was bought somewhere else and imported into India, was a huge expense basically on the customs and the tariff for importing that money to set up their labs. So if you are a growing company and you are looking to have an offshore location and you are going to have a bunch of equipment being purchased or bought or shipped there, just understand that this could be, add an additional 15 to 20%, if not more, cost on everything that's sent there. One of our current clients, we had to ship, they spec'd a medical grade PC that's about a $6,000 computer, and it took us $1,500 just in the tariffs just to get it out of the Ukrainian customs. So that $6,000 PC actually ended up costing $7,500 in the grand scheme of things. So that is one thing to keep up with. The cultural considerations are not just limited to the management and the workforce, but it's also, just like I said, more the personal and, how people are willing to express themselves and if they feel they have the ability to say no. A lot of cultures that you'll find where they may not be as forthcoming or being able to raise their hand and voice their concerns and say what's going wrong, you might find out that they won't question some of your requirements. That if you have a requirement written down, they will actually go off and they will write the code exactly what the requirement says without necessarily putting too much thought if it actually is beneficial to the product. One quick example of this would be we were working with one of the offshore company or one of our offshore companies. I'm not going to say which country, but the requirement basically said you had to divide two values, X and Y. And Y was on the denominator, and the range of values that was defined in the requirements actually showed that the denominator could have an accepted value of 0. Well, in software, if you try and divide anything by 0, you basically will get an exception. And depending on how you handle your exceptions, that may cause the application to crash. But ultimately, it's just a common thing that, that you should never divide by 0. And in this case, they saw the requirement, they didn't question it, they never brought up to anybody, they actually went ahead and they implemented it. And when they started testing and our test team started, validating it, we started to see these crashes all over, and it turned out because the requirement allowed the value on the denominator to be 0, they were not checking for a divide by 0, and they were allowing the application to crash. And they never said anything because the requirements allowed it. So that's just a unique perspective on what to be thinking about, that, these cultures, certain cultures may not have empowered their engineers or certain folks to have that voice to question what they're being told to do. So be very conscious about that. We talked a little bit about time zone management, and just to highlight once again, we're based out of Chicago, and when we're working with our Ukraine office, depending on where you are in the spring ahead or fall back, they can anywhere be between 6 or 8 hours time difference, and it actually lines up pretty nicely because it gives us a good 3 to 4 hours of overlap in our mornings. Between, let's say, 7 and 11, our time is their prime work hours for them. And so you can actually have meetings that are face-to-face over GoTo, get people on board. If your local staff is having issues, they're able to talk to them. And as you start migrating east across the time zones, going further into, Russia, India, Singapore, and ultimately China, depending on where you're in the U.S., that time gap gets larger and larger. My time bringing up the India center, we were basically 12 hours off. So I was up in the morning, every morning, taking calls with them at their 7 o'clock at night, about my 7 o'clock in the morning, and then I was back on the phone at my, like 8, 9 o'clock at night, their 9 o'clock in the morning, syncing up as we're doing this ramp-up period. And that went on for months, and that was one of the things that was very, that companies and people have to think about, and we're going to dive into your local resource impacts, but just understanding the time zones and what flexibility it gives you and what it truly means from being on calls and ramping up, because you will need to be on calls almost daily in the startup process. Ultimately, based on your product and based on where you're located, if the remote center is going to be your support staff going forward, also understand where's your product being sold. If there is issues, how are you going to do your customer support? How are you bringing in your customer support system into your development team? How is that interacting with your marketing? Where are your products located if you have servers, et cetera? It's all stuff that you have to be thinking about when you pick this location, and what it means to you and or your team when things are live and there's problems are being reported, and how you're going to have to work out those details. Once again, the last statement there, where are your customers located? If they're all around the world, when you're in bed, they can be logging issues. And, it's kind of nice if your support staff is in a different time zone, because they might get those faster than when you would. But also, if you're handling customer support here, but your development team is 12 hours off, they might not know about it, and your customer ticket might be sitting there for a while. So just one thing that can, a couple things in the time zone management to be very conscious of. Based on your locations and everything, you can come up with your work division strategy. You can actually have all the work and full ownership of work being done at the offshore facility. You can have a split workload where maybe the teams are divided to try and take advantage of the time shift. If you're doing more agile or paired programming type concept, you can sort of augment it and say, we might have 3 hours of overlap where we're going to work together, but when I go home, you're going to continue carrying the torch forward for the rest of your work day. You're going to send me a status email and everything on where you left off. And when I come back into my office, I'm going to have 3 or 4 hours of work before you get back in, but I'm picking up where you left off. And then we're going to sync once again over our 3 or 4 hours, make sure everybody's in sync, keep working on things, and keep doing this handoff philosophy to try and get more of your schedule met in a quicker period of time. I mean, the split workload also does not have to be like picking up. It can just be that you have your technical leads and certain individuals are doing stuff here, and other team is supplementing that team, but still working on their own individual work items and not in the more paired programming aspect. How you can split up your developments from your quality assurance, right? You can leverage the remote staff to just be your QA team that will look at the current requirements, write the test cases, execute the test cases, allowing your developers to not necessarily be involved, which is probably a good thing when it comes to quality assurance. Certain times you do not want to have the person who wrote the code also be the one who tests it, because they may be biased or have some assumptions in their head that are not true, and they may go down the wrong path. So it's always good to have an outside person sort of at least review the test plans and everything in regards to that. You know, when we talked about work divisions, you know, the ITAR may affect, you know, some aspects where the hardware might not be able to be delivered, but you still might be able to get offshore work done in the country as long as they're only doing a specific part of the application and isn't reliant on actually having the actual hardware there. Because then, like, the integration of their components and everything could just be layered upon what you're doing here locally and tested. And I already mentioned about the customs implications based on whether you're shipping, you know, equipment or, you know, just people going back and forth in regards to visas and training visas or business visas, and how that would all work to help make your product as successful as possible. So there's multiple ways to divide up the work. All of them can be done with the proper planning and oversight and the proper technical support in-house. One thing that seems to get overlooked all the time by senior management when they decide to offshore, everyone likes to look at the thoughts and say, oh, based on budget and time and all this other stuff, we're able to get X amount of resources over there, you know, somewhere else for the same that we'd pay to have one local resource, you know, here. Well, on paper, at a very high level, that may be true, but ultimately, for the first year, depending on how large your project is, it's definitely a misconception, and it's something that you have to be very conscious of to understand truly what you're going to get into. Your local resources, if you are actually going to try and bring up a large team, and that could be, let's say, 10 to 30 people, even if it's bringing up a smaller team, your local resources are going to be severely impacted early on. So if they have key work items to do and the normal worker is 80% efficient, you can almost expect that their workload is going to drop significantly down, and that their 80% efficiency is going to be maybe 10 to 20%, if not 0%, for at least a month, you know, depending on how large the team is and the project is, and their oversight's going to be training, getting the tools set up, ramping everybody up to speed, etc. They're just not going to be able to get their own work done. Once the other site, you know, is sort of there and they're also working, your local resources are going to be getting questions. They're going to realize the other team is making mistakes. Ultimately, your schedule may not allow for those mistakes to be occurring, and the local resource and the experts in those areas usually end up fixing the work and doing things themselves. So even though you may have 10 workers that are doing certain things, your local people may be doing 70% of the work for them initially. And all it is them fixing their bugs, and it's the growing pains of trying to set this up. And you can quickly burn out your local resources if you do not acknowledge that it's happening. Your local resources have to have the ability to tell you, and you have to have the metrics in place that show how much time is truly being spent working on their own items versus this transition ramp up and actually fixing your remote center's issues in the beginning. You know, so going along with just recognizing the fact that your local resources are going to be impacted, if you're going to start asking them to work significant amount of hours, just making sure that you understand that you should probably put some reward in place for their efforts and tracking the data and seeing how their contributions to the company are aiding everything and going forward as they are sacrificing a lot of their personal and or family time to do this for the company. When we brought up the one center, I was working 70 hours a week. I was trying to get my own work done because I was not allocated the proper time to ramp up the center and do everything I needed to. But I was working 70 hours a week for about the first 2 months. I was on calls in the morning, as mentioned. I was on calls at night. It was very hard, but it needed to get done. And, you know, putting in the effort up front led it to be a much more successful project and actually got the remote team up to speed faster. We eliminated some of those managerial hurdles, and we got right down into the weeds, and we just started working out problems. But your local resources are going to be impacted. Acknowledging it's a huge step. A lot of senior management in large companies just have their blinders on. They don't like it when their under management, you know, comes up and tells them that it's not effective and here's the reasons why. They're still looking at it from the bottom cost dollar sheet. And I'll tell you what, if you do not keep track of the regular metrics, since a lot of your employees are salaried, the fact that they work 80 hours a week it's still costing you the same amount as if they work 20. So from the bottom line, yes, you can see why these reports that roll up, seem so good, but ultimately your workers could get burned out, could look for other opportunities, and it's not good for anyone involved. Some general expectations and timeframes. I highly recommend, after you've done your cultural research and you've been looking at places that fit your time zones, trying to find the company that meets your needs, that you plan to travel early and often. More upfront visits to see their facilities, to meet the people, to meet the development team, to understand that culture and experience it firsthand so that you can start learning what works and what doesn't work in regards to interactions with their management and their cultures, how you can avoid doing something that might be offensive and take a step back in the overall relationship, and understanding it. The more that you can assimilate yourself into their culture and understanding it and working with them to get through some of these issues, the more respect and the more that you will actually see gets done. So I think this is critical, to go take a visit, make sure you see them, talk to them face to face. We talked about, do you have the influence over their management and hiring and reviewing who's actually working on the team? And do you have a say if certain people are not being efficient enough? And do you even have the data to show that their output is not meeting the needs and you want to get them replaced? In certain cases, like we did back at Motorola, based on the size of the staff, we had anywhere between 30 to between 70 to 80 people that we had to bring up between two different groups. One was mine on the operation and maintenance side. The other one was on the call processing side. And in every case, I would basically say, between whether it was Poland, Russia, Singapore, India, or China, before we were able to have that team be self-sufficient, that means that their management was running things well enough that when things came in, we were not reliant on having our local staff be impacted anymore, that they were actually taking ownership of functional areas, components, or certain pieces of the overall system. They owned it. It was their responsibility. They were able to estimate, they were able to manage, and they were able to get the work done with very high quality. But in those cases, it took about 2 years. And within those 2 years, we had a lot of growing pain in the first few months, definitely over the first year, as everything was trying to be ironed out. And our local team was severely impacted during that whole time. And it's not until, after that first year and up to 2 years, depending on the size of your team and the work items that you're doing, that they might not be self-sufficient. So that's, depending on how big your project is long-term, it may or may not be applicable, but, it's something to be thinking about. I mentioned the project meetings. You must meet with them. You got to talk early on. You got to talk. You got to spend the time. It's a must. Your technical folks need to be talking to their technical counterparts. The management people have to be talking to the management, and you need to be getting people put on, meetings. We'll talk about some of the tools. I'm a big believer in go-to meetings and sharing the webcams. There's nothing more priceless than the universal expression of someone just sitting there with that stare on their face, because you can tell they did not understand what you just said, or they're not getting what we're trying to accomplish. Whether it's a person in the U.S. On the other end of the call, or whether it's someone over in China, when you have a camera sitting there and you're talking about something, you can look at someone's face and you can understand and get a quick read on if they truly are understanding you. And if not, you can start asking more and more questions or give more and more details. But just being able to have that face-to-face meetings with the team, it builds trust, it builds a bond. It lets people, there's nothing like putting a name to a face and seeing each other and having them work it out. So I think that's very critical for the planning stages up front. So with that being said, we're going to move on to the tools and some tips from a project program management side. At PDT, we use Jira. It's an online tracking tool. You guys can go off and you can do a little research. I'm actually going to bring up, we have a development environment instance, but I'm just going to highlight it so you can see. This is, like I said, this is just a dummy project that we have created, but it's online. You can give your clients access to it. You can sign in. It gives you nice summaries that are all customizable, dashboards, but you can basically see, if you have versions planned, when the release dates are, an activity stream going through each of the tickets saying what's been done with it, your arrivals and closure rates, and this can be customized based on your days that you're looking for. Over here it's all clicked, so you can click on the issues. It shows you your current status of what the states are. You can create your own states for issues and workflows as they go through the tool from them being created. And we have our own workflow, basically where an item's new. When it comes in, it's marked as new. After someone looks at it, and we would then assign it to a component and the component owner for that area that it's been sort of root cause to, and it'll be sitting assigned. Assigned does not necessarily mean that it's being worked. Once they go to actually work on it, they'll move it to the open state. So once something's marked as open, we know that they're currently working on that item, and the ones that are assigned are not being worked. So in each of these issues, you can have priorities and everything and severities that I'll show you. So you can use those status and state fields with the priorities to make sure they're working on the right items. Once they're done with their work, they'll move it to the resolve state, meaning that they think their development level work is done, and then it's going to go off and be integrated into, and tested at the unit component level. And when it gets merged into the branch that it's going to get put into, it get marked integrated by your configuration management person. Once the official build is put out, the integrated issues are assigned to the test team, and then the test team will go take that build and actually run and execute the test to validate that those issues have now been fixed. And then if they are, they will close the issue. If they have not been fixed, they will take it from the integrated state and they will reassign it back to the development team. All that workflow and all those states, however you name it, is all completely customizable within this tool. All these links are filters already. So I can just search it by assignee, so I can be, like myself, and click here, and this will take you to the link that shows everything that. Oh, it looks like we might have a network issue here, but it would show all the issues assigned to me. There we go. Right. All these fields in the columns are customizable, and the layout's customizable, and you can do a detailed view, change your view, such that you can see the details in here about each item. So from the type, whether it's bug, new work, documentation, requirements, which version it affects, what version it was fixed in, who reported it, all this stuff is customizable, description, comments. It tracks the history of everything, and you can see the latest activity. So this is a very good tool. I would highly recommend people use this for any sort of issue and project tracking. Since it is online, you do not have to worry about things being lost in people's emails, getting lost in Excel spreadsheets, people looking at not the latest versions. It is a great tool, in my personal opinion. It's customizable and flexible and definitely worth your look at to help utilize. Lots of software firms and companies should be familiar with this already. Metrics. Coming up with how you guys are going to manage it, and milestones and putting phase gates to make sure that you're not getting too far down into the project without having things get signed off, to make sure that you and your consulting firm are actually doing exactly what you thought. Those are things, get those tools in place. How are you tracking those metrics? So is it, time charging categories? Are they filling it out against the proper phases? Are they matching it to specific issues that are being tracked in your tool, such as JIRA, such that when you run these reports and you gather these metrics, they will help your program and project management understand if they're truly on track, or these metrics will help identify that you are off track and that you need to take some actions. One of the great things is based on your phase of your project, if all your development activities are done and you're truly doing the system testing, and you're already 3 months into a 4-month system test cycle, and your incoming defects that are being opened is still on the rise, that probably lets you know that your system test and you're not going to be ready to launch at the end of the month, because as you're that close to the end of your system testing, you would expect that a lot of the defects would have already been found and fixed, that your incoming arrival rate would have been on the downward trend, and your fixes that are being resolved are on the upward trend. And you want to get to a point where your defects arrival rate is getting close to zero prior to launch. Now, that's the ideal situation, and many times your schedule and other things will not allow that to actually happen. But having those metrics and those quality gates, assure that you're going to make the proper steps and take the proper measures at the right amount of time. So thinking about the metrics and other tools you'll need to properly manage and understand what's going on in your project is key. As I mentioned, communication. We use Skype, just for instant messaging across multiple locations and multiple groups. We use GoToMeetings, and you can record your GoToMeetings, which is always great as well. As you're doing live work-through meetings and you're trying to explain some work items, being able to record it such that the remote team could actually go and play it back and actually look at the things, look at the screenshots, see exactly what was being done, look at the actual code that was being discussed and everything is a huge thing. So recording those and actually putting them online for the teams to access is just a huge thing to be conscious of. Schedules, keeping track of them. We use Microsoft Project. We talked about the need for the program management plan up front to set the expectations of the project, the roles and responsibilities, who's accountable, giving people the authority to make the decisions. Ultimately, when you're getting to a certain place when you want to release it, you're going to make some tough calls on what issues need to be fixed before you release, what new features to the existing testing that's been done by taking in a change request this late in the development process. That all should be talked about in your change control board that would be set up. Like, who are those authorities that look at all the remaining issues, look at your marketing and product new feature requests, and try and align what's going into which build, rolling out your release map and your product roadmap and scheduling it all and making those decisions as to the quality of what you're doing now without impacting it. The roles and responsibilities throughout this are very key. Making sure you give the authority to the right people to make the timely decisions, and you also hold them accountable. A lot of times, unfortunately, in big business, holding people accountable is usually for bad things, right? They never get rewarded or held accountable for the good things they do. They always seem to somehow get held accountable for the bad things they do. But with the authority, people are going to make mistakes, but the whole idea is that you learn from your mistakes and you do not repeat them. The main thing with software development is that you can have people in school, you can learn some things in school, like how to write a language or how to speak a language like Italian or Spanish or French, but just being able to speak it doesn't mean that you're properly applying all the years of experience and all the know-how that comes from actually implementing it in the proper manner and thinking about all the things that you have to think about as you formulate it. At this time, we would open it up for questions and answers. I hope this has been a useful presentation and webinar. This information is going to be posted online. If you have any questions, please submit them through PDT's website as well. And if you guys are looking for any support or need anything that we can help you out with, please give us a call. We'd love to help get your projects off the ground, even if it is just a supplementary, initial consultancy role. Thank you.